He stepped forward, though no one called his name. No lawyer, no security, just a plastic folder and an unshakable love for the grandmother who'd been wrongly accused. That's how Elijah Carter began to change forever the way Savannah understood justice. Savannah, Georgia, June. The air inside the old courtroom hung heavy, like even a whisper carried the weight of time. Outside, magnolia trees draped shadows across sun-drenched sidewalks. But in here, where justice was measured, a quiet storm was about to begin. At the defendant's table sat Ruth Carter, 72 years old, a widow and former director of the Magnolia Housing Fund, a long-standing nonprofit supporting low-income black families in Savannah. Today, she was facing charges of embezzling more than $17,000 0 cents in grant money. She sat upright, her frail hands clutching a worn Bible. Just as Judge Harold Blake raised his gavel to move on to the next proceeding, a small but clear voice rose from the back of the room. "Your Honor, may I please say something?" All heads turned. An 8-year-old boy, Elijah Carter, stood up from the last row of benches. Bright eyes, neatly trimmed hair, slightly dusty black shoes. In his hand was a cheap plastic folder, the kind kids use for homework. But today, it held something far more important. Judge Blake looked up, squinting over his half-rimmed glasses. "You, young man? This isn't a grade school hearing, I know. But Miss Ruth is the only family I have left. And I can't stay quiet when the truth hasn't been heard." In that moment, a ripple of surprise spread through the room. A few jurors leaned in, whispering. At the prosecution table, Greg Harrison, known for his near-perfect conviction rate, arched an eyebrow, his lips curling. "What now?" he muttered. The judge looked from Harrison to Elijah. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. "You can't act as legal counsel, but you want to testify?" "Yes, sir." "Not about the law. About what I've seen and what I know." From the defendant's table, Ruth turned to look at her grandson. Her eyes blinked slowly, maybe from emotion, maybe from fear that he might be stepping into harm's way, in a place where fairness didn't always prevail. "Greg," the judge asked, "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A child can't testify in a criminal case involving financial misconduct." Elijah stood his ground, eyes unwavering. A quiet strength radiated from him, not from age or authority, but from a deep understanding that if he didn't speak, no one else would. "Oh, give the boy 5 minutes," Judge Blake said. "No cross-examination, no objections, just let him say his piece." Elijah bowed his head slightly in thanks. He walked forward, still clutching his folder. Each of his steps echoed clearly through a space usually meant for much heavier feet. "I've lived with Miss Ruth since my parents passed away, car crash." "Oh, come on, 2 years ago. Back then, I thought the world had ended. She was the only one who wouldn't let me fall into silence." Elijah opened the folder. Inside, documents were organized with colored tabs, clearly marked, not thrown together. A system. Every Sunday, she'd sit down to go over Magnolia Fund paperwork. She let me help. I sorted the bills, green for spending, yellow for income. I was only 6 then. The jury let out a faint smile. Elijah pulled out a photo. Him and Miss Ruth at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and highlighters. Her face was weary but kind. Her eyes protective, as if shielding the boy beside her from the weight of the world. I didn't get most of it at first, but she was patient. She said, "You may not change the law, but if you understand it, you'll be stronger than anyone." He went on. "Last September, she started to notice something was off. Expenses that didn't line up. There was a $2,500 0 cents charge to fix the community center roof, but the roof hadn't been touched. I took a picture that day myself." He held up the photo. "Ain't jet printed, but clear. The building showed no signs of repair, and there was $1,800 0 cents for security equipment. But nothing was added. Same old cameras, same rusty locks." Soft murmurs began to ripple through the courtroom. Then came $3,000, $200 0 cents for outside legal services. But she never hired anyone, I know, because she told me, "We don't have money, but we've got friends and trust. It's enough to protect the people we care about." Elijah pulled out a sheet of handwritten notes, penciled in by Miss Ruth herself. Dates, amounts, suspicions. He pointed to each line. I helped her write all this down, not because I understood everything, but because it was the only way I knew how to help the person who helped me keep going. Every word from Elijah didn't just present evidence, it peeled away the layers of indifference hanging in the courtroom. Even the coldest faces began to feel their eyes burn. I'm not a grown-up, but I know what a lie looks like when I see one. And I know that if I don't speak up, my grandma's going to be judged for something she didn't do, just 'cause no one thinks an old black woman could be that honest. That sentence dropped into the room like a stone in water. Silence followed. Judge Blake sat still. A faint breeze from the ceiling fan brushed across his forehead, but something deeper was shifting. An admission within himself that he, too, had started to judge too soon. Elijah took a breath. He closed the plastic folder. His eyes were steady, his voice soft but firm. I didn't come here to win. I came to listen and to be heard. He paused, then slowly pulled out a small brown leather notebook. Its corners were worn, a few pages curled up at the edges. Inside were crooked, slanted letters in a child's hand, mixed with the steadier script of an adult. This is the investigation book me and Miss Ruth made. Started on September 14th. When she said, "Someone's changing the financial records without asking me." He opened the first page and pointed to a hand-drawn table of contents. The roof, security equipment, strange invoices, wrong signatures. She told me, if no one else believes you, then you have to be the first one who believes in your evidence. Elijah looked directly at Prosecutor Harrison. I know I'm just a kid, but what I don't understand is why the grown-ups aren't asking these questions. Judge Blake leaned forward. He'd presided over hundreds of trials, but this was the first time he'd felt interrogated, not by defiance, but by a chilling kind of reason. From a child. Me and Ms. Ruth went to the Magnolia Center every week. I drew a map of the office, where the desks were, the safe, the file cabinets. Elijah held up a letter-sized sheet, folded in quarters. He unfolded it, revealing a carefully drawn diagram marked with notes like where real receipts are kept, assistant's desk, loose zipper, window stuck shut, can't open. One juror whispered under their breath, "Oh my God," Elijah continued. "I wasn't trying to be a detective. I just figured if I understood where my grandma worked, maybe I could notice something other people missed." He flipped to another page in the notebook. A timeline. On September 19th, Miss Ruth found a new bank withdrawal she never signed. Elijah pointed to the top of the page. I wrote who signed instead. He went on. I tried signing Ruth Carter a bunch of times and compared them to the real ones. I noticed the underline in the fake signature was shaky, like someone was trying to copy it, but their hand wasn't steady. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. No one was looking at Elijah like a sweet kid trying to defend his grandma anymore. He was operating like an investigator, careful, methodical, aware of what he did and didn't know. I'm not saying this is proof, but if I, a kid, can spot the difference, then I think a prosecutor should have seen it before me. Harrison yanked at his tie. Elijah, unfazed, turned to a new page. I started making phone calls. Not to stir up trouble, but to check the facts. I called the company that installs the security cameras. They said they never installed anything at Magnolia in September. I asked them to confirm it in writing. Here, he held up a printed email, in color, signed by a rep from the local security firm. I also asked them, were the cameras working that day? They said fully operational, but in the prosecutor's report, it says cameras not functional under maintenance. Judge Blake glanced at Harrison. Harrison shrugged, mumbling, "That's what the local investigators reported." Elijah didn't respond. He simply reached into his folder for another envelope. I asked the security company if the cameras kept any footage. They said they did, and they sent the recording from that day. I have the video. The entire courtroom shifted as if on cue. Judge Blake tapped his gavel lightly. We'll review it later if deemed admissible. But go on. Elijah stood still for a moment. I know it looks like I'm going too far, but if my grandma's being charged because nobody followed through with the investigation, then this is the only way to stop a mistake. He picked up another statement. A list of every expense recorded in September. Each item was marked up, notes written in both his and Ruth's handwriting. I tried calling one of the companies that supposedly got paid. No one picked up, no real address. I emailed them, it bounced back. Elijah looked up, his voice soft but clear. So I'm asking again, if the adults in charge of this case had done those things, would my grandma still be sitting at the defendant's table right now? No one answered. A heavy silence blanketed the room. Judge Blake leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. He let out a breath. The boy had just used his first 5 minutes, not simply to recall memories, but to dismantle the prosecution's entire investigative process. And the judge knew the next part would only dig deeper. Elijah stood still. His hands were folded in front of him, the folder neatly resting on the witness stand. There was nothing dramatic in his posture. Just a kid preparing for the next step in a fight no one believed he could win. He looked straight at the prosecutor. Dr. Harrison, Elijah began, his voice still gentle, but now it carried a different weight. Can you tell me how many of the payments I just talked about you actually checked? Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't answer right away, then muttered through clenched teeth. We believe Mrs. Carter's role as financial manager is enough to establish criminal liability. Elijah nodded, as if acknowledging the answer. But then he held up a bold-faced printout, a bank transaction slip dated September 15th, $2,200, 0 cents withdrawn for emergency legal services. This one's the core of the case, he said. But my grandma couldn't have made that transaction. He lifted another document. Hospital records from St. Joseph's Cairnler, confirming Ruth Carter had been in the emergency room from 1:00 p.m. to 5:07 p.m. that day, because Elijah had suffered a severe asthma attack. I was there. I remember her holding my hand the whole time. A flicker of emotion crossed his face, but it passed. Elijah looked toward the judge. You can check the hospital's security footage if you want to. A chill swept through the courtroom pews. This wasn't just emotional appeal anymore. This was living proof, and it directly contradicted the prosecutor's claims. Harrison began to feel the heat at the back of his neck. He tried to keep his voice measured. The hospital records were not entered during pretrial discovery, presenting them now as a procedural violation. Elijah turned to him, calm and composed. Sir, I wasn't allowed in the evidence submission phase because you didn't believe any of us had a voice. The murmurs around the room grew louder. One juror whispered, "This kid is teaching him the law." Elijah continued, "I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but if you'd looked into it properly, you'd know my grandma couldn't be in two places at once." He pulled out another folder, this time a copy of a letter from the bank, confirming the transaction on September 15th was made from the office landline phone at the exact time Ruth Carter was in the ER. That number's not heard. She uses a rotary phone at home, the kind that can't make outgoing calls? He held up a photo of the old phone, taken with his grandma's beat-up cell phone. I checked the call logs. She didn't make any calls that day. But the transaction came from the office line, where she physically couldn't be. The air in the room seemed to grow thick. Harrison clenched his jaw but didn't fire back. Judge Blake turned to him. Did you verify times and locations before filing charges? Harrison replied like a machine. Mrs. Ruth was the account manager. We proceeded based on legal responsibility. Elijah raised his head. So that means it doesn't matter who actually committed the act? As long as someone's name is on the paperwork, that's enough to charge them? Harrison didn't answer, but the entire courtroom already knew what the answer was. I know administrative responsibility is real, Elijah continued. But is there any law that says you can ignore physical evidence? One juror, a middle-aged woman in a pale blue blazer, nodded slowly. And if there's no proof of who really signed, does the indictment even hold up? Elijah pulled out a signature sample, this time from a different bank where Ruth Carter held her personal account. He placed it beside the disputed documents. All of her real signatures have this natural curve at the end of the R, but the ones in this case don't. Judge Blake picked up the copies, sliding his glasses closer to his face. He compared them silently. I learned this comparison from a book Miss Louise gave me. It's called Forensic Signature Analysis. They even have a kids' edition. A few soft laughs escaped, not out of mockery, but out of awe for Elijah's almost innocent precision. He paused and took a slow breath. I know what I'm saying might be dismissed, because I'm a kid. But if what I'm showing is true, then how old I am doesn't change the truth. Harrison folded his arms and closed his eyes for a moment. Elijah pressed on. So I'm asking again, throughout this whole investigation, how many people actually checked whether my grandma was present when the money was withdrawn? Harrison stayed silent, and now he couldn't not be. Elijah paused, almost to let the room catch its breath. The boy didn't raise his voice or slam his fist, but no one could look away, not because he was performing, but because each of his words cut like a scalpel into the hardened flesh of the system. He bent down over his folder and pulled out a large ivory envelope sealed with packing tape, scrawled across the front in thick marker. "Open only if there's no other way." "Your Honor," Elijah said, eyes locked on the envelope, "my grandma and I kept this hoping someone would step forward and do the right thing." The courtroom held its breath, but no one has. He tore the tape, opened the envelope, pulled out an audio recording transferred to a CD, a bank statement, and a printed message log. He laid each item carefully on the clerk's desk, in order. "First," Elijah said, "is a recording of a phone call made on September 15th at 3:10 p.m., less than an hour after the key bank transaction." Judge Blake nodded to allow it to be played. Greg Harrison's voice rang out, crisp through the courtroom speakers. "Tony, I need this case wrapped up fast. The old lady's got no lawyer, no one behind her. We close it in 2 weeks. I need a conviction before the election cycle." "You sure about that?" Tony's voice replied. "Absolutely. Who's going to believe a black grandmother and her 8-year-old grandson?" The room froze. Harrison stood in shock. A juror dropped their pen, their hands gripping the edge of the bench. Elijah spoke, softly, but his voice carried. "That's how they talked about my grandma. Not about evidence, not about justice, about politics." Judge Blake stared at Harrison. He opened his mouth, then shut it. No words came close to an excuse. Elijah went on. "Second is a series of text messages between Prosecutor Harrison and his associate." Elijah held up the printed message. "Don't investigate the recipient company. Focus on Ruth's role. Close the file early. Avoid complications." "You didn't ask for a deeper investigation, sir. You actively avoided one." Papers rustled. A few reporters in the courtroom began scribbling down every word. But the most important part? This. Elijah pulled out a copy of Harrison's personal bank statement. He placed it beside records from one of the companies that had received fraudulent payments from the Magnolia Fund. October 2nd, 3 days after my grandma was charged. Mr. Harrison's personal account received $25,000 0 cents from a company called Riverway Consulting and Company, Elijah said, is one of the 3 that took illegal payments from the Magnolia Fund. According to the files my grandma kept, a clean knockout. Political motives, evidence suppression, money trails. Harrison shot to his feet. "Objection, that evidence is inadmissible. The recording was made without a warrant." The Elijah stood his ground. "The call happened on the prosecutor's office phone, where there's a recorded notice that calls may be monitored for internal review." Judge Blake confirmed with a light tap of the gavel. "Under Georgia state law, internal recordings at public institutions are legal when prior notice is given." Harrison collapsed back into his chair, like a shadow that had just lost its power. "My grandma used to tell me, the truth doesn't need weapons, it just needs a strong enough light that no one can turn away from it." Elijah turned to the judge, his voice softening. "I don't want to destroy anyone. But if no one else will protect my grandma, I'll do it. The only way I know how, by finding the truth." A full minute passed in total silence. "I don't want revenge," Elijah added. I just want to live in a world where people like my grandma aren't seen as easy targets. Just because they don't have money or power." The courtroom remained still. Judge Harold Blake removed his glasses and gently set them down on the old wooden bench. He had heard thousands of defenses, thousands of accusations, but never had a ruling felt this heavy. Not because it was hard, but because it was right. He stood, voice deep and resolute. "Mrs. Ruth Carter," he said, "this court finds you not guilty on all charges." A collective exhale rippled through the room, then a soft sob. Ruth brought her hands to her face, tears spilling into her trembling palms. Elijah stood by her side, holding her hand tight. He didn't cheer or jump like most kids might. Elijah just looked at her with quiet eyes, as if to say, "I did it." They stood there, the two of them, monuments to resilience and truth. An elderly woman once abandoned by the very system meant to protect her, and a child who once sat in silence after losing both his parents. Now they stood tall in the courtroom, rewriting the meaning of justice with their own hands. Not long after, Judge Blake delivered another statement. An official investigation would be launched into Prosecutor Greg Harrison for abuse of power, evidence tampering, and possible financial misconduct. Harrison said nothing, his face drained of color, his eyes vacant, like a man waking up in a world where he no longer held control. In the days that followed, the public erupted. News of the 8-year-old who took down a prosecutor spread across national television. Elijah Carter became a name people whispered with wonder, but he didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to go home, sit at the familiar kitchen table, drink tea with Miss Ruth, and sort paperwork like they did every Sunday. 6 months later, Elijah stood on the stage at Savannah Law School. Before him sat over 300 students, future lawyers, prosecutors, and judges. No one spoke as he stepped up. I think they just looked at him quietly, like people rise when a flag is raised. "I'm not a lawyer," Elijah began. "I'm just a kid who didn't want to let the woman I love be buried by silence. And I learned something. Justice doesn't happen when you win. It happens when you refuse to leave anyone behind, even if they have no power, no voice, or no money." In the front row, Miss Ruth sat tall. She looked stronger now, her eyes brighter, her hands no longer shaking. Beside her sat Miss Louise Bennett, the woman who had quietly guided Elijah every step of the way from the Carnegie Library to one who gave everything for her community, and one who passed down knowledge like fire. Now they sat together, watching their seed rise. After his speech, Elijah was invited to help launch a program called the Elijah Project, a legal literacy initiative teaching basic rights to students in public schools across underprivileged neighborhoods. And Elijah said yes, not for recognition, but because he knew if he had once felt powerless watching the system crush someone he loved, then there were thousands of other kids who felt the same, and they needed to know they weren't as powerless as people made them believe. Miss Ruth didn't rest after the trial. She was appointed to the Savannah Public Welfare Advisory Board, where she helped ensure transparency in how funds were distributed to the community. On national television, she said, "I'm not special. I'm just a grandmother who refused to let her grandchild grow up believing this world is unfair. And there's nothing you can do about it." A new state law, Elijah's Law, was passed in Georgia, requiring prosecutors in financial cases to present verified evidence of the defendant's physical presence and direct involvement. Other states began considering similar legislation. Top law schools added the Elijah Carter case to their curriculum on legal ethics and civil rights. As for Greg Harrison, he was convicted of investigative misconduct, disbarred, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. No one came to see him off. Once an untouchable figure of authority, now his name lived only in textbooks as a costly lesson. One day a reporter asked Elijah, "Did you feel sorry for Mr. Harrison?" He thought for a moment, then answered, "I do. I feel sorry for him because he had everything, power, knowledge, experience, and he used it to do wrong. All I had was a grandmother, a few books, and one good reason: Savannah." the following fall. Red leaves drifted down onto old slate rooftops. The streets were quiet, like the whole city was remembering a story that had forever changed it. In a public elementary school, a group of fourth graders sat listening intently as their teacher explained basic legal rights. The right to remain silent, the right to a lawyer, the right to a fair trial. Elijah sat in the back of that classroom. Not teaching, not as a symbol, just a boy who once dared to ask a question and now wanted other kids to know they could ask too. That evening, in the old house on the city's edge, Ruth sat quietly embroidering a handkerchief, a keepsake from her wedding. Elijah sat beside her, trimming stickers for the new student folders of the Elijah Project. "Grammar," he whispered. "What if I hadn't spoken up that day?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She looked up, eyes aged by a lifetime of pain and grace, and spoke with the calm of someone who had lived long enough to never lose faith. Then another child would have. "You're not a miracle, sweetheart. You're just the first one who didn't wait for one." A year later, Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her memorial was held at the community center, the same place where she was once wrongfully accused. Now the sign out front read, "Ruth Carter Hall," even in the quietest voice. Elijah stood in silence, looking up at the sign. He didn't cry. He didn't need to, because she had left him the most important thing, the belief that if you protect the truth, it will find a way to grow. Years later, in an interview, Elijah would say one final thing: justice doesn't win, it just doesn't die. As long as we keep raising it every day,